in this tutorial, uh, we will try to learn Spring, uh, which is essentially a framework to do a lot of coding in a standard way. So this framework is a collection of libraries, and these libraries provide annotations to again enable the standardization of code. Spring is able to tie up mm, a lot of things very neatly, like your object relational database like Hibernate, uh, object mapper, which is basically used to convert your REST calls into Java objects. And if you're returning any Java objects, convert them into JSON and so on and so forth. Unit testing, specifying your REST endpoints, configuration of applications, etc. Now, overall, Spring may require a lot of learning curve, but once you become an expert at it, it tremendously improves code readability and organization of the code. There are many other benefits of Spring. So, for example, if you have looked at some of our previous tutorials, we had to construct uh, a lot of Java objects, and so Spring provides this great mechanism called auto wiring, um, and we will have a look at it later. Um, but this really simplifies um, how your various class objects are basically initiated and then used across the code. Spring provides other libraries like Thymeleaf, which helps us write UI code easily, basically your HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, etc. And also easily create dynamic HTMLs. Again, we'll have a look at this in our tutorials. Then also it provides tools like Swagger, uh, which basically provides a default user interface um, to discover what all REST APIs are available in an application, and then play with those. And this comes like very handy when your UI developers and your REST API developers are separate people. So how does Spring work? If you looked at the Tomcat tutorial or web application tutorial carefully, essentially it was all about servlets. Now, uh, what Spring basically, I'm just giving like a high level sort of uh, intro or insight into how Spring works. What Spring basically does it uses a class to tell the application server, okay, ev- to run some servlet. Let's say, let's call it an initialization servlet or some piece of code to run that every time the server restarts. And so that is sort of like a hidden code that Spring has, and we don't need to worry about it that much. But this helps Spring configure itself, right? So how to read properties file, where to read it from, what classes to auto wire, what classes to scan, and we will have a look at that also uh, shortly. But what classes to scan to do all this auto wiring, etc., etc. And then again, it uses some class to tell the application server that okay, now I've configured myself. Basically, that Spring has configured itself. Then any HTTP requests that you are getting or other application server is getting should be handed over to a default servlet, all right, that Spring provides. And now basically Tomcat just sort of becomes like a pass through to Spring, and so all the requests are eventually coming to your application server, but then they are getting passed through to, let's say, sort of a Spring servlet, and from there, since it's a program, it can uh, do its own stuff, right? Basically, it can then invoke classes that we have written, which won't be servlets. All right. Okay. Uh, yeah, basically this point over here, right? So from there on, the Spring Servlet hooks invokes all the code that we have written. Also, in addition to this, Spring provides a mechanism to layer the code. Often what happens is that mm, if our code is not properly organized, it ends up into something what we call as spaghetti code. Sorry, one second. And spaghetti code can result in a lot of chaos and confusion as the project grows. Think about spaghetti code as a very, very, very badly created uh, movie, that you want to run away from after watching first 15 minutes of the movie. Um, but anyway, let's try to understand layering that Spring helps us uh, do. All right. So basically, you use at entity annotation to declare any database objects. Again, we will deep dive into all of these in time. At repository, it's used to write code to interact with the DB. So basically, what all queries you want to perform on the database. At service is used to write your application logic, right? So any class that is at service annotation, you'll put all your checks basically or mathematical functions or whatever, right? Here. Then add controller and rest controller helps us define those classes which will serve HTML or REST responses. This portion over here is sort of equivalent to your servlets. And then add configuration uh, allows us to create classes which are actually configuring the entire Spring framework the way we want it to get configured. Then Spring provides a lot of other annotations like add transaction, right? So which piece of code must be run in a single database transaction? Uh, if you remember our Hibernate tutorial, uh, we had to do like create session or begin transaction and end transaction. Uh, and that was like very, very repetitive. Um, and if you have to do like a 50 things, right? Then you don't know where the transaction starts or ends. It can all become very chaotic. And with Spring, you can just do with a single statement at transaction. Then at enable web MPC, this helps Spring know um, whether to enable serving HTML or REST responses. Then at enable transaction management, basically it helps Spring configure itself to enable at transaction kind of annotations and so on and so forth. Now, the problem with Spring is that Spring comes in two flavors. So basically, your classic Spring and Spring Boot. Uh, uh, so what is Spring Boot? Basically, they came up with a whole bunch of another libraries and annotations, um, which essentially configure Spring uh, even more easily, right? But after many years of programming, what we experience as developers is that Spring Boot does a lot of things behind the scenes, uh, and which makes debugging difficult because you don't know that by putting a certain Spring Boot annotation or Spring Boot classes, what all is actually happening behind the scenes, right? So that creates a lot of confusion. And then as a result of that, it results in lesser control over how we want to configure Spring, right? Um, we may want certain features, we may not want certain features. Mm, and Spring Boot will basically enable a lot of features, etc., automatically. And then, since it's doing so many things automatically, it will also download many dependencies that we don't want. And once the project increases in size, then all these dependencies, start clashing with other open source dependencies like Apache libraries that we may, want to use. And so we recommend using Classic Spring. In Incref, we all use original Classic Spring. All right. Okay, so without wasting any more time, let's have a look at some of the code. Now everything in this tutorial you should be able to find at GitHub, um, in the sorry in the employee Spring repository. All right, so github.com/incref/employee spring. I'll continuously keep checking in all our Spring related tutorial code over here. Okay, and another thing is, this it can be a bit intimidating at first, but just like you learn a car, driving a car over many months, and you become expert at it, and you get a sense of, okay, this is how I need to drive, this is what we need to do, right? You will understand all those things about Spring as well. So the first thing is to configure our POM. So if you look here, I have included a Spring library called Spring Web MVC. Now Spring has moved to version 5 or maybe even version 6. We are still lagging behind, but uh, I'll just use the version that we use at our company so that there are no surprises. Ignore these Swagger related libraries right now. And then in addition to this, Spring uh, uses Jackson data bind dependency to convert uh, REST calls into Java objects and Java objects into JSON, when it's returning. So we need to include this. And then Spring needs this JavaX servlet APIs also. So how do I know all of these things? It's after many years of programming, experimentation, reading online, debugging, etc. But this is like a basic setup that Spring needs if you're creating a web application. So all of that is there, and our good old Maven Jetty plugin is there, so that we can just run this code without copying our WAR files. So that is about our POM. Okay. Now I typically organize my code into different packages. So let's say Spring, and let's say controller. Okay. So the word controller comes from MVC, Model View Controller. You can read about it, but basically controllers uh, uh, are essentially enabling this part of the code layer, uh, which classes serve HTML or REST responses. Okay. So here I can create a class called Spring Config. All right. All my Spring configurations will reside in this package. And first, once I've imported all these dependencies, I can do add enable web MVC. All right. This annotation over here. The second thing I need to do is to tell Tomcat when it loads up that it needs to do the Spring initialization, right? So allow Spring to basically initialize itself, and then allow Spring to intercept all HTTP requests coming to the Tomcat server. So the way you do that is, I have this class over here. I'll just copy it over here. And again, these are all like, mechanisms provided by Spring. We read a lot of documentation about Spring. We discovered these. Sometimes the documentation may be lacking. Uh, you can purchase a book if you want to become like a super expert in Spring. But again, these are all like, one-time setups. We have done it at our company. Most people just reuse this code and so on and so forth. And basically, this class is a hook to initialize Spring configuration without web XML configuration. All right. So Spring provides this abstract class called abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer. Forget about the hairy name, but basically you just need to extend this class, and you need to tell uh, that hey, I'm going to use my spring config.class to initiate my Spring framework. And essentially what happens is when Tomcat starts, uh, if you look at this class deeper, all right, so this is an interface web application initializer, and when Tomcat starts, it will scan through all the code and it will figure out that hey, here is some class that eventually extends or implements this interface. And so then Tomcat will invoke some of its methods, and which will eventually lead to the execution of spring config.class, and which will configure the Spring. This all may sound quite complex, but trust me, once you start working on these things, it becomes a piece of cake. So I've enabled WebMVC. Uh, Now I need to create a controller, right? So I'll create a class called, let's say, API controller. The name can be anything. And I need to declare that this is going to serve JSON by providing the annotation at REST controller. And let's say I can have a method called public string say hello, uh, which returns hello world. All right. Now, what will be the URL of this? So that you can do by giving another annotation called, let's say, at request mapping. Um, Path equal to, let's say, slash say hello, and then I'm saying method equal to get, right? So remember that in servlet tutorial we had this do get, do post, all of these methods, and just see, I mean, just see here how easy it becomes. I can have any method that I want. I do not necessarily need to implement do get, do post methods. And I can tell Spring that hey, use this method to implement my path. All right. uh, and the HTTP method, and this dramatically improves our coding abilities and method naming and so on and so forth. So I can have another method called say hello to, all right, and this will be, let's say hello world to. um what else is required? Is anything else required? Yes. Now remember that Tomcat will eventually run this class, which through some mechanisms will end up running in this class. And I've told Spring to enable WebMVC, but I also need to tell Spring where to find my classes for different layers. All right. Oh, one more thing. I also need to declare this class as at configuration. All right. Basically this layer. Now, the way I can tell Spring is, I mean to tell the way I can tell Spring where all my other important layered classes reside is by giving it another scan called another um annotation called at component scan. Say, hey, scan everything under com incref.employee, right? So Java provides this mechanism called uh, reflection, and basically it allows Java code to inspect other code, etc., etc. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm telling Spring about this package, and Spring will then just deeply scan all the classes under this package, and then it will discover that, hey, there is a class called API controller which has an annotation called REST controller, and so let's use these methods in these classes to provide your servlet paths and methods and so on and so forth. And this provides a lot of control uh, over which classes you want Spring to scan and which classes you don't want. All right. I think that should do it. If you look at all this code, this like, I mean, I just wrote all of this code to um, sort of, help me during this tutorial. I will remove all of this later, but I think that should largely do it. Um, okay. So if we have this, let's do Maven clean install. Mm, Web XML is required. Um, okay, let me debug this and I'll get back to you. Okay, so the bug was that I had to provide a fail on missing web XML property over here, which is essentially used by this plugin. So now I can just do Maven clean install. All right, and now Maven jet colon run. Okay, all right. Now, if I go to localhost 9000 employee and I go to my say hello, I get my hello world. And if I do say hello to, I get hello to. So just imagine that yes, there is some learning curve, um, some, let's say, obscureness in the sense of how all of this is working. But just imagine comparison to all the pain we took to create our servlets. Just imagine, as compared to this, all we needed to do was to include a few classes or dependencies, help Tomcat understand how to initialize Spring, configured Spring, created my class, wrote some annotations, and I'm done. Okay. Now, uh, this is not a RESTful API. All right. So, let's say we actually want to return an object uh, and consume an object. Okay. So let's say, uh, let's make this method as post. Okay. And now let's create another package called model. Right. I use this naming convention to declare all the classes that will be used to interact with our REST controllers. So let's call it user form, and let's create a class called user data. All right. uh, and here let's say I'm taking a string as say name, so private string name, and then I need my getters and setters. Okay. um, and in the user data, again let's have these things, and I can say, let's say private uh, string message, again have getters and setters for this. All right. Now I can tell Spring that hey, you are going to receive an object of type user form in form of JSON. So you can, excuse me. So you can say something like at request body, let's say user form, right? So I'm telling that hey, convert the HTTP post request that you received, which is the request body, convert that automatically into my user form, assuming that you'll receive that as a JSON. And then let's create a user data. All right. And let's populate with set name as user form dot get name, and then data dot set message howdy. Okay. And then let's return this data instead of our string. All right. So that's all you need to do in Spring to implement a REST interface. I mean, any you can have any amount of business logic that you need, but principally that's all that's required. So no need to convert REST into Java object, sorry, JSON into Java objects and vice versa, and all of that stuff. All right. So let's go to our Postman. Okay. So let's create a new collection called employee spring. Okay. And here I'll add a request. So let's say post request, or say hello request. Okay. The method is post over here. Uh, the body is uh, let me have a look at this. Body is okay, let's just put a raw body which is JSON. Okay, and we need to say name colon Romel Jain. We might have some bug in this. I might need to debug. Okay, so and URL is localhost as say hello, and let's do a send. Unsupported media type, right? So I need to have a header for my content type. Uh, Let me debug this and get back to you. Okay, so I needed to send my content type as application JSON. There's a HTTP header, and this way the client, either the browser or this postman, is telling Spring that hey, uh, I'm sending you a JSON body and interpret it as such. Uh, right, I get Romiljan howdy. Let's say if I put here, let's say Anisha, do uh, I get Anisha howdy, right? So all of this code is working beautifully. Now, as an application developer, it becomes hard uh, when you have like 100 APIs like this to enable your web application. And so Spring provides something called Swagger uh, that you can use to see all the APIs that are available. And just like we have to configure things in Spring, we have to configure Swagger. So in addition to so basically in addition to what you have already, um, we need these two libraries, uh, SpringFox Swagger 2 and SpringFox Swagger UI, and I have the version also over here. So once you have done this, you get even more classes and annotations. All right. And I like to create a class called REST config. Okay, because I'm configuring my REST classes over here, and there's a whole bunch of boiler code that we need to provide. Okay. So first of all, this is also a configuration, right? So when Spring is scanning all the classes, it will find this class and say, hey, this is annotated with that configuration. So I need to run a few methods over there to configure it. Uh, and and again, we need to do a little bit of black magic over here, that this class extends WebMVC configure adapter. Now again, how do I know this? By reading online why it does. Again, most of this is like just you know 0.5% of your very large projects. And anyway, so now you need to do all of these things. What are like various resource handlers? How do I get an instance of docket and blah blah blah. I will not go into details of all of these things. What's important here is that this is how you configure Swagger. And I'm telling it that hey, you should Swagger should be scanning or using all the classes under com incref employee controller package, and anything that has a path of slash API, just display those. All right. uh, and so now in my API controller, I can have, let's say, slash API slash say hello. All right, that's it. So let us see if my slash API slash say hello works. So that's what I get over here. But once you have configured Swagger, you can go something to something called Swagger UI.html, and I'm not getting my API over here yet. And for that, you need to annotate this class using slash API annotation that Swagger provides. All right. All right. Oh, sorry. So the class should be at API. Sorry, my bad. The at API annotation should be over the class, And here I think you would require one more annotation. uh, Let me just have a look at this. Yeah, you need an annotation called add API operation. These are provided by Swagger, right? These are coming from the dependencies that we included. Um, all right, let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Let's go to our Swagger UI. I don't yet see my APIs. Let me debug this and get back to you. Okay, so the bug was that we need uh, another annotation to tell Spring to enable Swagger, right? So we used annotations to tell Spring to enable WebMVC. Now we are using another annotation to tell Spring to enable Swagger, and that's basically it. And then if I go here, so I get this Swagger UI.html all out of box. So a bit hard to understand all these configurations. Sorry, I'll just close this. So close this part also. Bit hard to understand all of these configurations um, and annotations, but once you get used to it, you'll start really loving it. But we get this, and now what can I do? So I see my API over here, and remember I told Swagger only to provide those REST endpoints which start with slash API, and that's just what we see over here. And now I can interact with my application without using Postman. So I give here, let us say, incref, and I try it out, and I see the response body. And so this is a wonderful, wonderful tool for backend developers to test their code quickly, see that hey, everything is working fine, and any UI developer to understand what all APIs are available and so on and so forth. Um, and what do the interfaces look like? And let's say now if I put even my say hello to, um, okay, let's say as user data. All right, and let's say since you're not taking any name over here, I'll just say default user, and it returns data. All right, now if I go to my Swagger UI, I should be seeing, sorry, I need to add this one also. So I go to my Swagger UI, I should be seeing two APIs, which I do. One is post and one is get. And if I just try it out, I see default user howdy, right? And Swagger also tells you the curl command, what all headers it's sending, what all headers it's receiving from the application, and so on and so forth. Right? Once again, in Cref, try out. See, it's automatically sending content type as application just JSON as a header. And so yeah, we have created our basic REST controller. Excuse me, configured Spring. Once again, I know all of these annotations, etc., can be a bit head spinning, but once you have this all set up, you don't need to worry about anything else in Spring. Uh, Once again, to review, Uh, I tell Tomcat how to configure Spring by using this mechanism where I'm tending to Tomcat, hey, start everything from Spring config. From Spring config, I need the add configuration annotation, and I'm telling Spring to scan every class under com in grep employee, and I'm also telling it to enable WebMVC. So Spring scans all of these classes, and on its way, it discovers REST config, which is another configuration. And so Spring reads this annotation and enables Swagger. Swagger needs a, a bunch of configuration, which we have discovered by many months of understanding reading in depth. You don't need to worry about it, you just need to configure and use it. That's the advantage of having libraries and frameworks. And then Spring goes on to scan other classes, and on its way it finds this API controller, uh, enables this to serve requests on these paths and these methods, and you add bunch of other annotations to tell Swagger which APIs should be exposed on its user interface. And then when everything is set up nicely, you can receive JSON automatically, you know, as Java objects, and you can just return Java objects which get converted to RESTful JSON responses. And that's about it.